Story number 1, The Watcher in the House. In 2014, a young family from Westfield, New Jersey, was thrilled to have finally purchased their dream home. The Broaddus family, Derek, Maria, and their 3 children, had saved for years to buy the stately 6-bedroom house at 657 Boulevard. It was an idyllic neighborhood, perfect for raising a family. But before they could even move in, something happened that turned their dream into a nightmare. 3 days after closing on the house, Derek went to check on some renovations when he found a letter in the mailbox. The envelope had no return address, and the handwriting was strange and childlike. Inside was a message that sent a chill down Derek's spine. "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. I have been watching the house for decades, and now it is my time. Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? You have brought me new blood. It will help me keep watching." The letter was signed simply, "The Watcher." Shaken, Derek rushed home to show Maria, and they immediately contacted the police. Despite an investigation, there were no leads on who could have written the letter. Days later, another letter arrived. This one was even more disturbing. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for generations. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, my father in the 1960s, and now it is my time. Have you found all the secrets hidden in the walls? Who will be sleeping in the bedrooms upstairs? I know their names now, and I will be watching them. The Broaddus family was terrified. The letters continued to arrive, each one more menacing than the last. The Watcher seemed to know intimate details about their lives, when the children were playing in the yard, which rooms they had chosen for them to sleep in. Derek and Maria never moved into the house. They were too afraid to put their children at risk. They hired private investigators, installed security cameras, and even tried to sell the house. But the media attention and the unsettling letters scared away potential buyers. The Watcher was never identified, and to this day, the case remains unsolved. The Broadduses eventually sold the house, but the new owners have refused to speak publicly about whether the letters have continued. The story remains one of the most terrifying unsolved mysteries in recent history. A beautiful home in a quiet suburb, tainted by an anonymous, unseen stalker who never revealed their face, but always made sure the family knew they were being watched. Story number 2, The Woman in the Basement. In 1971, a family from a small town in Indiana was thrilled to move into an old Victorian-style house that had been abandoned for several years. The Millers, husband, wife, and their 2 children, had bought the house for a surprisingly low price, considering its size and charm. The real estate agent explained that the previous owner, an elderly woman, had passed away in the house, but the Millers weren't fazed. The first few weeks in the new house were uneventful. They settled in, unpacked, and began making the place their own. But soon, strange things started happening. At first, it was small, footsteps in the hallways at night, the sound of doors creaking open and closed when no one was around. The family brushed it off, thinking the house was just old and settling. But then the children, both under 10, began complaining about a woman in the basement. They said she was old and wore a long dress, but she never spoke. She would just stand at the bottom of the stairs watching them with dark, sunken eyes. At first, the parents didn't take their claims seriously, assuming it was a product of the kids' imaginations. But then the strange occurrences became more frequent and unsettling. The family's cat, normally calm and playful, would hiss at empty spaces and refuse to go near the basement door. Cold spots began to appear throughout the house, particularly near the basement stairs. One night, Mrs. Miller was alone in the house while her husband was working late. She was putting the children to bed when she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the basement. Thinking it might be the wind, she ignored it. But then the tapping grew louder, turning into a steady, rhythmic knock. Grabbing a flashlight, Mrs. Miller cautiously approached the basement door. She opened it slowly, shining the beam of light down the wooden stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, just as her children had described, stood an old woman in a long dress. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and wrinkled. She was standing perfectly still, staring up at Mrs. Miller, terrified Mrs. Miller slammed the door shut and called her husband. They called a priest to bless the house, but the activity continued. The final straw came one evening when Mr. Miller went down to the basement to investigate the strange noises. He swore that he saw the old woman standing in the corner watching him. He quickly ran up the stairs, locking the door behind him. The family moved out shortly after, leaving the house empty once again. Years later, a local historian revealed that the elderly woman who had owned the house before them had been found dead in the basement under mysterious circumstances. Her death was ruled natural, but rumors had circulated for years that something darker had taken place in that basement. The house still stands today, empty and abandoned, with no one willing to live in it for long. Story number 3. The Haunting at the Hotel. In 1992, Jane Michaels, a travel journalist, was sent to write about a historic hotel in New Orleans. The hotel had been built in the 1800s and had a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in the city. Jane, a skeptic of the paranormal, saw it as just another assignment. She arrived at the hotel late one evening and was given a room on the top floor, room 302, which was said to be one of the most haunted. The hotel staff warned her that room 302 had a long history of strange occurrences. Guests reported hearing disembodied voices, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling unexplained cold drafts. But Jane brushed off the warnings and settled in for the night, eager to explore the hotel and write her piece. That night, as she lay in bed, Jane heard what sounded like faint whispers coming from the corner of the room. At first, she thought it was just the wind, or the creaking of the old building. But then the whispers grew louder. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and pleading, though Jane couldn't make out the words. Curiosity overtook her fear, and she got up to investigate. The whispers seemed to be coming from the wardrobe in the corner. Jane opened the wardrobe, expecting to find nothing but empty hangers. Instead, she found a small, old-fashioned locket lying on the floor of the wardrobe. The locket was tarnished, and when she opened it, she saw a faded photograph of a young woman. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold. The whispers stopped, replaced by the sound of soft sobbing. Jane turned around, and to her horror, saw the figure of a woman standing at the foot of the bed. The woman was dressed in a tattered old gown, her face pale and gaunt. She was weeping, her eyes filled with sorrow. Jane stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman lifted her hand, pointing towards the window. Jane glanced over and saw that the window was wide open, though she had closed it earlier. Without thinking, she rushed to the window and slammed it shut. When she turned back, the woman was gone. The next morning, Jane learned that in the early 1900s, a young woman had leapt to her death from that very window in room 302 after her lover left her. Guests had reported seeing her ghost ever since, always appearing near the window where she had taken her life. Jane left the hotel that day, shaken and unable to explain what she had seen. She wrote her article, but left out the details of her encounter. Though she had been a skeptic before, she left New Orleans a believer in the supernatural. To this day, the hotel remains one of the most haunted places in New Orleans, and room 302 is rarely booked by guests brave enough to spend the night.